Hello and welcome back. This is the week 14 lecture. So now that we are finishing up our second critical response, I think it's time to start talking about our final paper. This is, of course, due at the very end of the semester. I had originally planned to spend a little bit more time on it, but we had an extension on the second critical response. We've taken more time, tried to improve those. So now, with our final 2 weeks of the semester, we really need to talk about the final paper and start preparing it. Today, I just want to talk about the assignment in general, just go over the basics, and then next week we can think a little bit more about outlining and research, and hopefully we are drafting, maybe putting something together by week 15, because that is our final week of instruction. And then after that we have exam week, and that's the end of the semester. So the final papers are due during exam week on December the 16th. I believe that falls on the Thursday of that final week of the semester. So, we have time. We don't need to feel rushed, but this is a bigger assignment than what we've been doing previously with the critical responses. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the assignment, and hopefully, because we are either finished with the second critical response by the time we're watching this, or at least, hopefully, we are working on it, we are in it, and getting near the end. Because I did give you guys essentially 2 extra weeks to do those. We probably could have submitted them at the end of week 13, after Thanksgiving, but we have until the end of this week, week 14. But some of us might already be done, or again, hopefully you're getting close to done, and you need to start at least thinking a little bit about the final paper. So this is a literary research paper. So there's actually a couple of chapters left in the book that I would like us to take a look at over the course of this week and next week. One's about research, and one's just about how to write a paper like this. So we can be pretty flexible at this point. We don't have any more discussion posts, but I would like you guys to read chapters 5 and 6 in our books. Be the final time, the final couple of times that we're using our book this semester. Chapter 5 is very short. It's only about 5 pages, and it's all about finding research, basically how to find secondary sources for your paper. And secondary sources are just the books and articles written by scholars and critics that you're going to use in your papers to support your arguments. So you've all done 102, you've all done that big research paper that's kind of the centerpiece of 102. So you have experience doing this kind of work. The basic parameters of the assignment here aren't all that different from what you did in 102, but the topic is going to be different. Now, obviously, we're still conducting literary analysis, just like we've been doing all semester, but now we're bringing in those outside sources to further support our claims, and we are just going to build longer, more complex arguments. But what we are doing with those arguments is pretty much the same as what you've done before with previous research papers. So we're kind of familiar with this genre. But what you need to remember about this final paper and what makes it different, really, from everything else is we're going to be choosing one of the critical approaches that we've learned about this semester. So this stuff should still be pretty fresh in your mind. Remember, back in chapter 4, we took a look at the major schools of critical approaches. And now we just need to pick one, and then we're going to apply it to a text of our choosing. So you guys can still pick one of the texts that I've posted to the modules. I've posted a pretty good number. So, obviously we chose one. We've chosen a couple for our critical responses, but there's still some others there that you haven't written about yet. So you can use one of those, but I'm also opening up your options here. For the final paper, I want you guys to write about stuff that you are interested in. I want you to choose text that you like, text that you have a lot of ideas about. So you have a lot of freedom, but of course that can be a little dangerous if you don't, use it the right way. So I do want to talk a little bit more about the text that you choose, but I'll kind of get to that in a moment. But you will choose a text, and then you choose a critical approach that you want to apply to that text. And that's basically how you're going to get started and how you're going to sort of tackle the big paper assignment. So I recommend going back to chapter 4 and maybe reviewing some of the content in that chapter about the different critical schools or approaches. You can also go back and rewatch my lectures. So remember, we started with text-based critical approaches. So we talked about formalism, the new critics staying inside the text, really paying close attention to language. They kind of helped to pioneer the techniques of close reading that we still use today. So just a really hyper intense focus on certain features or elements of language, like figurative language or imagery or symbolism. They were very interested in lyric poetry because they could analyze things like meter and rhyme scheme, other aspects of form, hence their name being formalists. So we talked about that, but then we also talked about structuralism and post-structuralism, more recent schools of criticism, which are also very much focused on language and what language does, how language operates, and in some cases the instability or sort of arbitrary nature of language. So those are the text-based schools. You can pick any of those, obviously, formalism, structuralism, or post-structuralism. Post-structuralism is also known sometimes as deconstruction. So, you can use either term, but any of those are fair game. And then we moved on and we talked next about author and reader-oriented approaches. So these were a little bit simpler. We talked about the sort of biographical approach. That's the author-based, where we're really sort of centering our analysis around the biographical details of the author. And I was reading through your discussion post. I think a lot of us agreed that the biographical approach is helpful in certain instances. In certain cases, it's perhaps not the best of all the approaches because it's somewhat limited. Not all authors really put a lot of themselves necessarily into their work. We know that some do. Some authors are very autobiographical. Or in some cases, like many of us said with Hemingway, since we've read him, that we do sort of think about his own life in reference to some of his work, because maybe some of the themes in his work seem to be things that perhaps he was dealing with in his own life, just based on what we know. Again, certain authors who are celebrities, who are famous or were famous, we can sometimes do some interesting biographical work with them. So that's a pretty easy approach to understand. We might not always want to use it, but it's certainly an option. And then we talked about the reader-oriented. We talked about reader response, where we're really focused on how audiences receive texts. So obviously, we are interested in people's individual interpretations, but we can also look into things like, book sales, or, how texts are talked about or written about, when they're, first hitting the market, when people are buying the book, reading the book, what are people saying, how do people feel? We can sort of explore emotional responses that readers might have, the way they respond to the text. So remember, the formalists and the structuralists and those older sort of text-based approaches, they didn't really care that much about the author. They weren't that interested in reader response either. So that's what makes those schools different. They came along a little bit later and sort of said, wait, readers matter. The reader response school in particular was almost kind of a response to formalism and sort of this statement that, hey, readers do matter. Without an audience, without readers, these texts wouldn't really do anything. So we should be interested in what readers think. But remember, and many of us talked about this on the discussion board, with reader response, we do have to sort of limit the number of possible interpretations, because while we like, and I think most of us nowadays embrace, the idea that any reader can really form his or her own original valid interpretation of a text, and it might be different, than my interpretation or my friend's interpretation, and that's fine. We endorse that generally in English class, but we talked about the implied reader and the idea that most authors are sort of writing for a particular kind of audience. So that implied reader is not a real person, but it's just the type of person that is likely to read this work of literature. So in that way, authors can kind of target a certain demographic, a certain segment of the population. It's not maybe necessarily intended for everyone. And we talked about this, the book talks about this. A lot of times the implied reader is going to be sort of an educated, cultured person, perhaps. And that can bother some people, and not all texts necessarily have that type of implied reader, but most texts have some kind of an implied reader. So we can always look at that in order to kind of figure out who the intended audience is. That's also a part of reader response. So you can use that. We're all kind of using it to a certain extent, because we are all arriving at our own original interpretations. But if you really want to use the reader response approach, I would recommend that you look more into the reception of the text. You can look more into questions of audience, intended audience, and stuff like that. But that's another option. And then most recently, we talked about the context-based approaches. So these are the approaches that kind of leave the text a little bit, and they're interested in the context or the surroundings, the things that are all around the text. So you might think of these as sort of like ideological approaches. These are often theories or ideas that develop sort of outside of the world of literature, but they're being applied to literary texts. So we just ran through some examples. We didn't really cover all of the different context-based approaches, comprehensively. We just kind of ran through them a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the Marxist approach, the feminist approach, the post-colonial approach. We talked about new historicism. And I would recommend that at least some of us use that approach, because it's very much in vogue today. A lot of critics use it, and it's very effective, especially if you're reading text, written or set in previous periods of history. Basically, new historicism is sort of the old-fashioned historical approach to texts that I think I've mentioned, is kind of a very traditional way of reading literature to kind of look at historical context. People have done that for hundreds of years. It almost kind of predates most modern schools of criticism. But what makes new historicism kind of newer, more cutting edge, is we're just sort of thinking more critically about history. And like I said a few weeks ago, we're kind of thinking about history, the narratives that make up history. We're sort of reading those as if they are literary texts. And then we're looking at the literature almost like it is, in some ways, kind of like a historical document. So there's this kind of this crossover where we're kind of putting the literary texts and the larger historical context kind of on the same level, reading them both, and learning about history or using history in that way. So that's one of those context-based approaches, but there are many others. Like I said, we kind of jumped through several of them. We didn't get really terribly in depth about any, but that's okay. For the paper that we are doing, we don't need to be experts. We just need to be familiar with it. We need to be acquainted with it. So, and again, this is really where research comes in. Once you know what critical approach you're using, you can start to gear your research maybe towards that approach. You're going to start looking for sources that kind of align with your critical approach. So if you want to take a feminist approach to a text, it would be good to maybe find some feminist criticism that touches maybe on some of the same things that you're talking about. And again, if you're using post-colonialism or new historicism, any of these context-based approaches, if you're using structuralism, if you're using formalism, the biographical, whatever, there's going to be other stuff out there that's also kind of in that same school, in that same critical school, and you'll be able to access at least some of that stuff if you're doing good research. So we kind of have multiple steps here. You need to choose a text that you want to write about, and again, choose one of mine, one of the ones that have been posted in the modules, or choose your own, and then choose the critical approach that you want to use, that you want to apply to that text. And then you need to start maybe doing a little bit of research. So next week, I'm going to do an entire lecture on finding sources. You guys can certainly get started on doing some of that work now, but this week, but I'm assuming that at least in some cases we're still finishing up our second critical response. So really the goal for this week is just to get started on the final paper. Start making some decisions. Choose your text, choose your critical approach, and do some early pre-writing. Get some ideas down on paper, just start brainstorming, start thinking about what kind of argument you might like to make about your chosen text. And we've talked about this a little bit with the critical responses, and I've written this in some cases in my feedback. Some of us need to get more argumentative and not just sort of, share a common, very, often taught, very familiar interpretation of these texts. We need to arrive at our own original interpretations, which in some cases might be somewhat similar to some of these other common readings that are already out there. But we need, in some cases, to do a little bit more to stake out our own claims and to be original and to make a strong argument. And that's why I'm letting you guys choose your own text, because in many cases, and I want to talk about this for a moment, in many cases finding contemporary text, stuff that you guys are reading right now, perhaps outside of school. And again, this can be anything, a graphic novel, a contemporary novel, genre literature, meaning like sci-fi, fantasy. It really doesn't matter. It needs to be fiction, or poetry or drama, but I don't really care what the subject matter is. And in some cases, the more contemporary, the better, because, there might not be a ton of stuff written about it. You can still find sources. And as we'll talk about next week, not all of your sources necessarily have to be about that specific text that you're focusing on. In some cases, you can have sources that talk about the larger genre, that talk about certain conventions or elements that just happen to be present in the text. So we'll talk about that a little more when we're getting into research next week. But you can still find sources even if you're working with a contemporary text that hasn't been written about a whole lot. And I find that it's actually a good idea to do that because it gives you more room to arrive at an original interpretation if there hasn't already been a lot of critical work done with the text. Because you guys might have noticed that with a lot of famous texts, like, a short story by Hemingway or a poem by Sylvia Plath, you're going to find a lot of stuff online. There's a lot of summaries. There's a lot of paper mills because other people assign these works. So there's stuff out there about these works. There's good stuff. There's good criticism. There's good, literary scholarship written about them. But there's also a bunch of stuff you can find easily online that's kind of designed to help students. And that stuff's not very helpful for an assignment like this. So with more contemporary text, you don't get bogged down in all of that, and it's easier to arrive at something original because it's just something that hasn't been studied and talked about and written about as much. So that's my advice. If you guys pick something super famous by a really famous author who gets taught all the time, and there's just a ton of work out there on that particular text, I actually think that makes it harder. We often think that will make it easy because we'll be able to find sources, we'll be able to find summaries, maybe we don't even have to read it, but that doesn't allow us to get close enough to the text is generally the problem. And I hope that through these critical responses, we've kind of learned that we need to really engage closely with the text. That's what literary analysis is all about. It's not really about summarizing. It's not really about, telling us what happens in the plot or sort of recapping what a particular character does. It's more about digging kind of beneath the surface, finding certain elements or features that are interesting and meaningful, and then making our own original points about them. Quoting from the text, looking at what characters are saying, looking at, specific features of language. That really requires kind of close, hands-on work. So once you've chosen your text, even if it's something that you've read before, even if it's something that you're very familiar with, I recommend going back and reading it again and annotate it. Again, maybe we've been doing this at least with, recently, maybe we are doing it as we speak with critical response too, but whenever you're working with the text, you need to quote from that text. As I've mentioned, you need to use specific examples from the text. So it's always a good idea once you have your book in hand to go through and underline some key passages, maybe take a few notes, write a few reminders, jot down the page numbers where there's some really good stuff. You're going to use some quotes from those pages. That's just kind of the standard preliminary work that you need to do before you start drafting, before you're actually writing. Just to give yourself something to start with, create an outline. I've posted a sample outline. Well, I don't think I have this week, but I'll have one up by the end of the week, and it will be there throughout week 15 as well. So get some ideas down, get familiar with your text, and then create an outline. It would be great if by the end of this week we are outlining and maybe just doing some simple searches in the databases for our chosen text. So I've already put a few things in the module, just some sort of basic research tips. I'm assuming most of us in 102 used the GBC databases, or at least we were shown them at some point. So we probably know how to get there, but I'm kind of giving you the basic directions. Go to the GBC library homepage, go down to databases. Really, EBSCO and JSTOR will probably be all you need. There are some other databases that will help you find sources about literature. But again, we want scholarly, academic books and articles about the text that we've chosen. So you can get started on that later this week, but again, I'll have a lecture about research next week. So next week will be the final lecture of the semester. I'll sort of do two things. I'll talk about research, maybe a little bit about outlines in the first half of the lecture. And then in the second half, I want to talk about citations and just a few other odds and ends, some things about editing, final post-writing steps, because that will be the last time I talk to you guys, and you'll still have about another week or so beyond whatever point you watch my week 15 lecture, but that will be my last chance to give you editing tips and a final sort of citation check. So that will be next week. Let me know if you have any questions before then. And again, take a look at the assignment. It's posted. Read through the details. And if you have any questions, or if you want to run a text by me, if you want to know, about one of your potential choices, just email me. We can always exchange emails. Or if you want to talk more about the final paper, we can set up a video conference. We can talk in any number of ways. Just get in touch. At this point, late in the semester, it's important that you guys communicate with me. If you have questions or if you need anything, just get in touch. Okay, I will see you next week for the last time.